welcome back to another episode of Trade with Conviction. I am Felipe Sherman, and here I am with James and Phil. Hey guys, good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
Well,
We'll start as usual with a bit of the geopolitical context, what's going on. I think, Phil, you and I slightly disagree on what's going on in the sense that I actually think that nothing has really changed and we keep just hearing the same kind of rhetoric from Trump. And what I mean with the rhetoric is essentially that a lot of mixed messages, very unclear path forward. You will have within the same tweet or truth post very conflicting messages like everything's going great, and at the same time we will obliterate you, we will bring you back to the Stone Age. Not the kind of thing you want to hear when you're on the other side. But to summarize what I'm seeing, and again, yesterday there was a speech, everyone was waiting for that speech. It was supposed to be de-escalatory. The market was reacting extremely positively. Crude was down, equities were up significantly, but then nothing happened, and again, the speech, which was, I think, a 20-minute speech, was pretty much, in my opinion, the same kind of rhetoric, which is things are going great and we're meeting our objectives. No one really knows what those objectives are. So it's easy to meet them or not meet them when you don't have objectives or not clear ones. And at the same time, we will be threatening massively and we will destroy and bring this country back to Stone Age. I don't really feel we had anything new this week, but maybe, Phil, you have a different opinion.
No, I think what I thought changed yesterday from that speech was that from most of the tone of the tweets and everything that had come out before, felt like it was trying to talk down the market. Felt like it was trying, there was an effort to, everything's okay, we can escalate if we need to, but everything's okay, we're going to focus on talks. I'm talking to these people, trying to talk the market down. And ultimately, the conclusion that we got from the speech yesterday was a very concrete, actually, there is escalation coming. Right, we've got 2 or 3 weeks now of going hard, and I find it difficult to sell that as bearish now.
When you think about who are you addressing these tweets to? Right now, the problem that Trump has is that he needs to address multiple stakeholders. On the one side, you have the market. You need to suppress prices. You need to give this idea that everything's fine, that we're meeting our objectives. Don't worry, guys, it's all good.
Over soon, yeah.
At the same time, you need to talk to Israel and the GCC countries saying, hey, we're still in this and we're going to meet our objectives, the real ones that I'm not telling everyone, but you guys know what the real objectives are and we're on it and we're sending the troops. You're negotiating with Iran through these tweets as well, sending the message that we will obliterate you. So it's extremely difficult to sort of address multiple messages to multiple stakeholders in one single tweet. And that's where it gets a bit confusing for everyone. But that's where I think that really nothing has changed. And we're still in the same situation. Hormuz channel is still blocked. But if I have to recap a bit the messages, if you want, is that, okay, we're talking to Pezeshkian, the president of Iran, and things are going great. We're having great conversations. They're not radicalized. That's the bearish kind of message. Then there's the other message around we're only focusing on targeted operations, removing manufacturing capacity, obliterating their navy, things like that. Again, very close to achieving our objectives. But at the same time, as you rightly pointed, you don't send 7,000, Marines and troops, etc., just for a suntan, So it does feel like he's gaining time for that military, maybe boots on the ground operation. That boots on the ground means if you do get boots on the ground, you're no longer talking weeks, you're talking months and God forbid years, So it's a very different situation. That is the escalatory aspect. And as you said, Phil, we need to look at the facts, not so much the rhetoric, but the facts. And the fact is that yesterday, or I think this week, the UAE sent a letter to the UN asking for Article 7 authorization to use of force to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That is a fact. That is escalatory. If I understand correctly, they're trying to reclaim certain islands that are critical for that passage that were taken from UAE by Iran in the 70s.
Just very quickly, there's 3 islands just kind of to the west of the Strait of Hormuz where the waters are particularly shallow and the ships have to go particularly slowly. And those are seen, therefore, strategically as being very important to not just, this is somewhere that Iran can strike shipping more easily from. And so you need to take that to stop that. But also if you can set up a base there, have radar situated there, you can allow your fleet up the sea there towards Karg Island easier, and you can see the drones and the missiles coming earlier, and it helps your interception. So these are three very strategically important islands, and they're also politically important for the allies in the region, i.e. the UAE, to reclaim sovereignty on those.
What you're saying makes sense because you cannot just think about the short term, which is, okay, we need to reopen that strait, but you need to think about the longer term. And we talked about the toll booth, where Iran's intention with that negotiation is to have the authority or the ownership of that strait, and therefore becoming a toll booth, a bit like Suez Canal or Panama Canal. And obviously that is not something that, in my opinion, is probably unacceptable in the eyes of the GCC countries. So when you are taking these measures, you're not just thinking about reopening quickly, but you're also reopening in a way that is sustainable long-term for their own economies and their own independence, etc. So this, again, goes back to this whole escalation, de-escalation. For me, nothing really has been solved. And honestly speaking, no one, I wouldn't dare to say when this will end. I have no idea. No one really has an idea.
Indeed.
But what we do know from what we heard is that at least the next 3 weeks. Okay. Yeah. So what does that mean? It just means that you have 200, 300 million barrels of oil that is, again, lost, that is not going to the market. That is now a new certainty. Yep. So we're now talking, let's say, end of April, which I remember when 2 or 3 weeks ago, we said that this could last until May. And I got all kinds of messages from people saying, no way, this is too big to fail. It will never happen. Well, no, we're getting there. When you start a war, you know how you started it, but you never know how this ends. That's the reality. So that's the context.
We've been talking a lot about kind of it's important not just when this finishes, but how it finishes. And I think that's, what you were getting at there in terms of what is the state of the Strait of Hormuz if and when there is some kind of ceasefire or, when this finishes, because that is going to determine the medium and long-term future of the regional energy market. Because if you don't manage to come to some kind of resolution where you've stopped the risk of this happening again, then you are higher for longer, not just because you need to find workarounds, but you need to find supply from elsewhere, because this is not sustainable supply to the market.
You're absolutely right. The how question now is extremely relevant because, once again, the idea was that this was going to be a short war. Probably the anticipation is there was going to be an internal revolt, which is less and less the case, particularly if Trump goes ahead with his threats, bombarding civil assets like desalination plants and power plants and things like that. Then any country will then just, we have a new enemy now. Again, it's no longer the Revolutionary Guard. It's now Trump. But the how is very important because with all of these stakeholders, GCC, Israel, Iran, in Europe, and we'll talk about this in a second, that just will take longer when you need everyone to agree. The more people you have in a meeting, the more complicated it is to get a direction of travel. So again, this just is telling us that this is going to be lasting for a bit longer. And maybe, as we said before, this is just gaining time, trying to suppress prices on oil, trying to give the rhetoric to the market that, we have a plan and it's going to solve. We don't know exactly when, but it's going to happen. And at the same time, getting those troops ready. And let's see, as I said, no one really knows what will happen. But I go back to my original statement. Nothing has really changed in a week. It's just longer, and that's it. That's my opinion.
Yeah. And so far, Iran has been employing this retaliatory escalation, right? They could have escalated bigger, but it's a retaliatory escalation strategy throughout. And bombing power plants, desalination plants. There have already been some attacks on Iranian desalination plants, but small ones. If that goes bigger, they have that list of targets. Like they know what they can hit, and that anytime that kind of escalation happens and those infrastructure get taken out, you're just extending the period before we go back to some kind of normality.
They've shown they're incredibly well prepared, the Iranians. More than
they've known this day could come for the last 40 years, right? 50 years.
Indeed.
Yeah, every single army has prepared for this. They all had a game plan. They all knew what will happen. And the U.S. Army, the Israel, the GCC, Iran, of course. It seems like, I may be mistaken here, but I think that Israel and U.S., they had this intelligence at the time that gave them that plan, or that long-term war will not happen, that war of attrition will not happen, because we have enough evidence here that points to a very short-term resolution. And that conviction led them to go for it and disregard that long-term plan that every single army had, and that actually Iran is just following the playbook one step at a time. So we'll see. But going back to markets, Phil, on a supply and demand basis, can you tell us a bit more on demand destruction, SPR releases, etc.?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring it back to the numbers, basically, right? We know that we're losing somewhere in the region of 10 million barrels a day supply. Estimates vary. 10 million is probably medium to lower end of that range. And so if we're thinking about how do you counter that? Well, we've got the SPR release that was already announced. That's somewhere between 2 and 3 million barrels a day of supply coming into the market. And now we're seeing more and more demand destruction. So especially in Asia, estimates at the moment, the latest I've seen is roughly 1 million barrels a day of demand destruction may have already been happening. But if we put those two together, we're looking at 3, maximum maybe 4 million barrels on the SPR release supply and then demand destruction side versus that 10 million or more that we're losing every day. This can't continue, right? This way, or it is continuing, but we're looking more and more likely that we will need further SPR releases and that we will need more demand destruction. And so the question is, where does that come from?
And of course, Asia's been taking increasing amounts of Russian oil. So India started the ball rolling, 60 million barrels of crude purchased from Russia. Philippines took ESPO, South Korea, NATFA, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Japan in talks with Russia as well. Now, the US waiver is for cargoes that load before March 12th, and unloading and payment has to be completed by April 11th. And of course, all of these deals have to be backed by governments because they're just very, very tricky indeed. Now, the question really is will there be an extension? Or will governments be pushed to even buy direct from Russia and ignore sanctions? Discounts on Russian and, of course, Iranian oil have narrowed. The loser, perhaps, is the Chinese teapots. Run rates have heard to have fallen to like as much as low as 50%. ESPO spot premiums versus Brent were minus $8 per barrel, now plus $8 per barrel for April-May shipments. And Iranian oil was minus $10 per barrel and now sits close to flat to Brent. It's really an evolving situation.
Those barrels are clearly part of the supply side kind of response, right? They need those barrels in Asia, it's clear, and they're going to pay for it. The US waiver on the Russian barrels, they have to be loaded before March 10th. Those people are going to be able to fudge bills of lading, I'm sure, to get those barrels to where they need to be. But ultimately, these are all little sticking plasters to try and take down that oil and water. And we've seen that the oil and water that had built up and, the glut that we were talking about at the beginning of the year, that's already largely gone now in the East.
And so that's an important element, is that it's largely gone. So, because we're no longer talking about supply optimization and things like that, we're way past that. Now it's the governments that are intervening and saying, yes, if I buy Russian oil, I will get into problems with Trump. But you know what? I'd rather get into problems with Trump in the future than having problems internally with my people right now. So that's happening. And the scary part, if you want, as you're saying, Phil, is, and that's why maybe we're not yet seeing that price action on headline like crude or things like that, is the fact that we had this oil in the water and we have seen demand suppression, because we'll talk about all the initiatives that the governments are doing, but they're more like makeup. Let's put it this way. It's not yet any kind of draconian rules or anything like that. But we have not yet reached, and when you think about it, it's only been a month. A vessel takes a month to get anywhere in the world, but we're already seeing those kind of signs. For me, this is just the beginning of a much bigger sign to come in terms of demand destruction. To a certain extent, if I asked you guys a month ago, when do you start seeing demand destruction? I probably imagine you wouldn't have seen it within the first month. It's probably more in 2 or 3 months after the beginning, but we're already seeing those signs of demand destruction now. We're already seeing signs of lack of oil, lack of supply within the first month, which tells you this, how the oil market operates in a very just-in-time kind of way.
Hand to mouth, yeah.
And thank God we had all of this oil and water, Russian supply, Iranian supply. Again, for me, this is just the beginning. It's scary, but it's just the beginning.
I think it was Morgan Stanley that put out a global map, essentially, of where we're going to see the impact of missing AG barrels and when. And so we've got over Asia, it's a big kind of circle that says first week of April. Europe's middle of April, US late April / not quite so much. But East Africa's already happened, right?
Yeah.
And so you're seeing a lot of necessary now demand destruction also in parts of Africa. that are having to redirect flows from the West. If we focused on Asia for a second, because we've got a little section here just to talk about what governments have done so far and maybe what they can do. If we're talking about kind of security of supply, even the big net exporters like China have announced refined product export bans. They announced that very early. And so far, China are probably the ones who haven't tapped SPRs because they haven't quite needed to yet, because they were largely reliant on those Russian and Iranian barrels and that are still coming. But they will likely need to do that, or they are simply in a situation where they're going to run lower, and they know that they're going to run lower, and therefore they need to kind of conserve those product supplies by not exporting. We've got China not exporting clean products, probably because they're going to run lower rather than wanting to tap into their crude SPRs just now. And so what that means, and we talk about gasoline and how gasoline is maybe less affected than distillates, but at least for the Singapore market, they're losing a pretty big chunk of those Chinese oxy barrels that tend to go into the blend pool in Singapore, but they are still getting the MTBE barrels. So that's at least something for that market. But we're largely seeing that China's been the first one for the product export bans, but there have been follow-ups as well across the region.
And what's the status now with the SPR release? Because that was a big story a couple of weeks ago. Headline number was roughly 400 million barrels, I believe. But according to IEA, it is eventually up to the governments on how they release this. James, do you have any more information on that?
Yeah, well, Japan chose to release the initial volumes very, very quickly. Sales of heavier crude like HAFG and Haut to local refiners, and an ongoing negotiations for lighter crudes like Murban and Arab Extra Light. South Korea has announced that they will draw down 22.46 million barrels of SPR, but details of those release and timings haven't really been communicated yet. But they have really jumped the gun, those two.
And on the demand consumption side, we talked about it a little bit, but maybe we can have a little quick rundown of what the governments are actually doing to reduce consumption.
Yeah, so highly import-dependent countries, and particularly in Southeast Asia, have moved to various degrees of work-from-home measures. So Thailand, Vietnam, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. I mean, the list is really tragic.
Yeah.
Aiming to reduce the demand for transport fuels. Australia is opting for like an LNG for oil product swap with Singapore. Yeah, will that work with Singapore? But that's what they're trying to do anyway. While sourcing more imports, of course, from the US Gulf. I mean, everyone wants those barrels now. Australia also reduced the flashpoint for spec for diesel by 1 degree C for 6 months to allow more jet fuel into the diesel pool, essentially. We've got fuel rationing. Bangladesh, Myanmar, early on. New Zealand with 4 phases on the national fuel plan, currently phase 1. We've got Thailand, a 3-phase contingency plan, currently phase 2. Oil rationing would prioritize essential services, setting operating hours for petrol stations, control on electricity use, and adjusting opening hours for retail shopping malls to match available energy supplies. I mean,
well, it gives you flashbacks to some of the measures of government intervention. Obviously, that was a slightly different reason for doing so. And in Europe so far, we've seen kind of mostly talks about price caps. So mostly kind of shielding consumers rather than trying to bring down demand. But at some stage, that's going to start to become...
That cannot be part of the solution long term.
The longer this goes on.
And when I listen to what you just said, James, I feel bad about, claiming that what the governments are currently doing in Asia is makeup. I use the word makeup, but when you listen, it is not a makeup. All of these measures are relevant, are important, are impacting people's day-to-day lives. But my point remains, it is still early on. It's
early
still
days.
One month we had SPR releases, we had oil on water, we had all of these sort of like backup plans, plan Bs, if you want. But we're running out of those plan Bs. If you're already seeing this within the first month, first of all, as you said, Phil, this is going to be moving into Europe very soon. And you will have just more and more of these measures going in Asia. But at some point, that's it. There's no more. You cannot go to work, and then you just work from home or things like that.
Yeah. There's little bits that people are doing on specs. I mean, obviously, James has mentioned the Australian diesel spec changing a little bit. On gasoline specs, largely you're seeing kind of increased ethanol blends being allowed. But these are largely kind of policies that have already been announced previously and are just being speeded up a little bit. So E10 in Vietnam, E15 in the Philippines, these were things that were planned but are just being kind of brought forward now. Same on diesel a little bit. Thailand's going to B7. India made a big announcement. We're now at E20, but in reality, they were already blending 19% on average ethanol. So there's little bits of kind of supply that you get.
You don't have enough ethanol in the world or biodiesel in the world to
exactly. Right. It's all.
You're emptying all the drawers.
The buffer's going. Yep.
Should we then talk about what does it mean for pricing? What does it mean for trading opportunities? At the end of the day, that's what we're here for. Who wouldn't get distracted with geopolitics and what's going on in the longer term? It's just we're living in a crazy time and we need to talk about it. But let's go back to what we actually are here for, which is markets, trading opportunities, etc. So Phil, maybe let's start with going around and what's happening in the pricing market. Give us a summary.
So, starting on the light ends, the last couple of weeks we've been talking about how gasoline has really been lagging distillates badly. We've had a little bit of a correction now this week, at least in the East. Sing 92 cracks are back above $30 a barrel, but the EBOB crack's still around 20, right? The East-West has gone out to over $12 a barrel again. But I think, in Europe especially, it's becoming more and more difficult to justify why those cracks haven't moved higher. And we've got Russia also now with their gasoline export ban coming through provisionally until the end of July. It's not huge volumes, right? Maybe it's about 100 kbd typically, but it's all adding up. We'll talk more about how kind of those European barrels are being pulled east. I know you've been talking to a few people this morning, so at least on the gasoline side, tell us where you're seeing.
Maybe I can answer that question of why. I think the key star player here is James, and we all want to hear what you have to say about diesel because that is the market right now. That is the one. So I'm going to try to make it as quick as possible on gasoline because that's not really the story right now. In my opinion, gasoline is what we're seeing right now is, first of all, we have a confirmation of everything that we've been saying or seeing in our tool for the last week. So essentially, the ARBs are now fully open from Europe to places like East Africa, Pakistan. We've seen now 4 LR2s being fixed into East Africa. Something like 3 cargoes going to Pakistan, all of this from ARA. But the reality, and talking to traders in the market, is that it's extremely choppy. So first of all, you don't have a lot of liquidity. Everyone is chasing for vessels and you get a lot of flakes. So you think you have a deal, but then finally that vessel moves away from you. Someone else fixes it, or there's a gap on price on freight. Vessel owners are now demanding or asking to go via Cape, which again adds another 10, 15 days of voyage. And also your economics now need to be based on Cape rather than Suez. That just complicates things. So at the end of the day, we have also lower demand from the Med, obviously places like Lebanon or Israel, but also North African countries that are heavily tourist dependent. And also they don't have that much money. So they're now cutting. We saw Egypt now asking people to close shops and all that a bit earlier. All of these things are just compounding. And then the last thing is the Atlantic basin. So on the Atlantic basin, we've seen 2 main things. First of all, Dangote. Dangote now is full steam ahead, producing max and pretty much taking all of the market share in the WAF. So that's less demand from Europe. And you also have the story on EPA and Jones Act in the US. So the US has now allowed for a waiver on Jones Act and a waiver on the RVP spec, which basically allows for more naphtha to be blended into the pool. And also the US has applied a waiver that I think is only from the 1st to the 20th of May. But God knows if that will be extended or not. But the impact is essentially that you are now able to blend CBOB instead of RBOB nationwide. And the main difference is RVP. So you go from 51 kPa to 69 kPa, or essentially 7 psi to 10 psi. And on a blending perspective, that essentially means that you can blend much more naphtha. And then you need to compensate that naphtha with something else. That generally will be, first of all, alkylate. And then when you run out of alkylate, then it will be reformate. But what it also means is that you are probably a little bit of butane, which is, quite rare in summer. What it just means is 2 things. One is that the US becomes much more self-sufficient because they had all the naphtha, you have the C5s, streams, etc., given the very light crude they run on. And you have on top of that the Jones Act, then, Pad 3 will then be supplying Pad 1, will be supplying Pad 5, and there's less of a demand. So what I hear from European traders is that, yes, the ARBs are open into East Africa, into Pakistan, or even Australia, but they're A, still not open to Singapore, which is the pricing center. B, you don't have this sort of sustained demand because, again, in summer, the main demand should come from the Atlantic basin for Europe. And East Africa is not going to be replacing that. That's not enough. So bottom line is that right now, you have pockets of demand, you have panic buying from certain countries, which creates opportunities, but then it's very choppy, it's difficult to capture. And on the Atlantic basin, which is summer bread and butter, you have the US saying thanks but no thanks, and you have West Africa saying thanks but no thanks. So right now, it's less of an immediate kind of situation that you will talk about on diesel, and it's much more of a slow burner. Because at the end of the day, on a global supply and demand perspective, those molecules there's just less of them. But you're not seeing the impact now. And that's sort of what I'm hearing in the market right now.
I think just very quickly to pick up, there's a lot more naphtha potentially into the US gasoline pool. And I'm wondering if that's probably now linked to a combination of that and the attacks on Ust-Luga that have seen Russian naphtha exports falling, that we saw April gas naphtha is now at something like $60 a ton. It's back up to 70 now, but very, very low. And gas naphtha in Europe being that low obviously raises your blend costs typically. And so we've seen the paper arbs responding very strongly, right? TA arb has gone from being something like minus 18, so net RVO, gone from minus 18 and is now in positive territory. And what that has meant is that it's actually gone further than what you would have needed to compensate for this narrow gas nap. And we've started to see the Atlantic Basin destinations, places like Brazil, Colombia, Guatemala, a lot of those over the last day or two now have actually started to point back to Europe. So to your point in terms of Europe actually needing to find some more sustainable demand, that TAR has now gotten to a stage where maybe it is trying to open up those Atlantic Basin destinations, especially if the US is going to be more domestically focused. So maybe that is now an outlet or will need to be an increasing outlet for ARA European gasoline.
Yeah. So what would be your trade idea right now, Phil, based on all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I would be long an EBOB crack at plus 20, right? Now $300 a ton on an outright basis, spread between diesel and gasoline in Europe. You're minimizing gasoline yields as much as you can. You're losing light ends supply out of Russia. The US is more domestically focused. They're choppy, but you do have this pull on European arbs, European gasoline into the east. Maybe European gasoline now also into parts of the Atlantic Basin. I know Dangote is running. I know the US is running and able to supply more. Maybe not an April crack, but certainly a May crack now feels like a strong buy for me.
And the DFL. DFL is also hurting.
Yeah, so that's something which has really come in the last couple of days, I suppose, partly on the latest escalation, but also it seems that there's just European refiners are starting to feel that competition in particular from the east now and are paying up and up for that local crude, which means that the DFL is now at plus 12 or something like that, which is really eating into margins.
Yeah,
so
wow.
We were talking previously about in recent weeks, European margins look pretty good. And despite, absolutely astronomical distillate cracks, fuel oil hasn't really followed. Gasoline's not particularly high. And we're seeing at least kind of medium and simple complexity margins being not very workable right now, are actually negative for a lot of crudes. Only really TI-linked crudes are still workable, and the complex margins are weakening. So I think we do need to see EBOB or gasoline picking up just to make sure that European refiners do actually continue to run full.
Very interesting.
I would just add, a little caveat to what you said. I mean, I would say, yes, I'm surprised to see the crack levels right now. But as I said, right now, for me, the story on gasoline is still very choppy. And the key word is choppy, meaning that there's no clear direction. There is a clear direction, bullish if you want. If you had to choose one direction, it would be bullish, but there's not like a highway. It's not the story of diesel, of jet right now. But as I said, the US is now becoming self-sufficient, but it's also the cheapest source of supply into many LATAM countries. Can that last? I don't think so. WAF is self-sufficient right now, but they also have very low stocks. Can that last? We've seen many refinery, pushing extremely hard. Can that last? So I think that the direction of travel is still bullish, but I would say it's more of a Q3 story or maybe June story. If I was a betting man right now, I would be putting more on June or Q3 cracks, which are, frankly speaking, very similar. Yeah, and that's more of a safer bet, I would say. In the meantime, I think that the focus should be on diesel and jet.
Yeah, let's bring James in.
Yeah, and also interesting to hear about gasoline. I mean, I guess also selfishly from like a distillate point of view, I guess there must be quite a lot of heavy naphtha being moved into the jet pool currently. But anyway, the dominant story among many dominant stories in distillate is just Asian diesel tightness. Singapore spreads have essentially doubled over the last week from $25 per barrel, already a ridiculous number, to over $50 per barrel. And overnight, after Trump's speech, up to close to $70 per barrel. I mean, convert that into dollars per ton, times 7, $500 per ton backwardation in Singapore diesel. I mean, this isn't just paper tightness. As we kind of discussed before, it's real supply constraints already biting in many parts of Australia. In Australia as a totality, and many, many parts of Southeast Asia as well. The gas oil east-west is also a striking signal. That's up to over $100 per metric ton in a week to over $250 per ton. And overnight again, after Trump's speech, essentially, up close to $400 per ton, the gas oil east-west in the prompt.
Yeah, so the traders I've been speaking to who typically look at these things, right, they're saying there's no liquidity out there. Nobody's willing or really able to trade these ARBs at the moment in the way that they used to. That's contributing to this pretty ridiculous volatility that we're seeing. So it's very difficult to try and trade this right now.
Choppy. And it's so choppy and it's so volatile. And I guess a certain amount of just like de-risking as well. I think maybe people just don't want to get involved in it. And arbitrage flows as a result of this are being forcibly redirected. So you mentioned some limited Chinese distillate exports. West Coast India LR2s on both diesel and jet, just predominantly all are pointing east rather than west. I think Europe has a real precarious position already here or coming. Every conventional diesel supply arb into Europe is closed. US Gulf or US Atlantic coast, East Coast Canada, all shut. Asian arbs closed and pointing away. West Coast India arb pointing east, of course. I mean, steep freight rates are making a big issue here as well, making these marginal economics harder. The honest question I really think now is, in maybe even the short term, but the short to medium term, where does European diesel resupply come from?
Well,
I don't really think there's a clear.
We've also seen that there are vessels already underway that are taking diesel out of Europe and putting it, moving it to Asia. So we've seen European loading diesel moving it to Asia, and the answer of where does European diesel come from? It's there's SPR releases, but that's very short term sticking plasters.
Drop in the ocean, right? And then jet, of course, dramatically elevated as well. Although, interestingly, and kind of pointing, I think that the impending crisis in Asia is more diesel-focused than jet. We saw Singapore regrade at the beginning of the week move to minus 10 in the prompt. Overnight, after Trump, minus $18 per barrel in the prompt. Some of that regrade softening probably is down to demand destruction, as we've discussed at length, cancelled flights. But I don't really want that to be mistaken that the jet market has not been fixed at all. There are still serious issues there. So we've got, of course, West Coast India, LR2s we've already spoken about, pointing east. European jet pricing remains very strong. So we've seen some inflows from the US Gulf, the US Atlantic coast, New York, unbelievably, on jet as well. Dangote, as you kind of mentioned, the gasoline has also kind of taken up some of the slack as well in the Atlantic. But I just don't think this is enough to halt European gains. It can't fill the 2/3 import deficiency that we're in Europe. Also, the US, we've heard about the Jones Act, but the US West Coast, which typically gets most of its jet from East Asia, the premium for LA jet have just been skyrocketing. Where does that get resupply from? It's a real crisis. So that kind of leads me into some trade ideas. And beyond just kind of buying everything, it's pretty hard to argue against sustainably high and elevated ice gas oil spreads and cracks. The HOGO move already shows that the issue is more intense in Europe than America. So I guess continuing declines in the HOGO, we need to open up these ARBs. Singapore diesel cracks and spreads, almost unbelievably, the numbers I read out before. I find it hard to make a bearish argument that the limiting factor is demand destruction. There's no supply solution to it, really. European jet cracks and spreads as well. We've already seen, for example, the Ryanair CEO saying that he expects in June that he'll have to start cancelling his least profitable flights. So again, the stop for European jet pricing is demand destruction. I would also be bullish the gas oil east-west from here as well, but at $400 per ton. I'm really interested about the lower down in the curve, or further down in the curve, that's quite calm at the moment, like kind of flat.
James, you were pointing out earlier in the week that it seemed odd that we had this very wide and very positive April east-west, but that May east-west was still negative. I guess that's probably rolled up by now.
Yeah, that's rolled up, yeah. After Trump, again, it has rolled up. I guess I would still be buying the back of the curve on the east-west liquidity problems as they are. But also, there has to be the caveat there that part of that weakness in the forward east-west might be a reflection of the impending crisis coming in European distillate supply as well.
What are the deferred spreads, June, July, or July, August on diesel?
Yeah, Yes, it's not like they're low. May, June, ice gas oil, 170. Let's jump forward to August, September, plus 40.
They're not cheap.
Honestly, I guess I'd be thinking that's probably still a buy, plus 40.
With these levels of backwardation, there's nothing left in tanks by then, right? Nobody's wanting or willing to hold on to any kind of inventory at these levels. So you're emptying stocks extremely quickly. It's only going to make the issue worse. I was going to finish on this, but I was just going to take a quote from our colleague Hua's fuel oil commentary yesterday, which I really loved. He was talking about fuel oil, but it applies now to basically everything, especially distillates and fuel oil. So he said, regional balances are determined by regional supply, regional demand, and interregional flows. And a redirection of those interregional flows is the proper solver when you've got overall supply and demand relatively intact on a global perspective. But right now, it's a different story with a massive chunk of crude at the very heart of the global complex shut in, and we will all feel more of this in the coming weeks. So you can't fix this with ARBs. Right, you can try in the very short term to do a little bit, redirecting, try and put out fires, but you can't fix this with ARBs. Ultimately, you have to fix this with demand destruction.
We've been saying this from the beginning. I mean, when you have a problem of this magnitude, I always look at this on what is the problem and how do you solve this. The immediate short term problems are solved with spreads. Because even cracks don't do the deal because it takes time for the cracks to produce more gasoline, more diesel, more jet, whatever. But the immediate one is spreads. Yeah. Then the second immediate one is geographical spreads. So it's okay. I bring because it takes a bit longer. First of all, I make sure that my tanks are empty. Then I bring more supply from other regions of product that has already been produced. And then the third thing is cracks in terms of impact. So how you solve the longer problem is cracks. And that is already done. The real story then is, okay, right now with the problem that we have, all of these things are just makeup. It's just, okay, we're solving the immediate problem, but the real problem can only be solved with demand destruction. And as I go back to what I was saying before, what we're seeing right now from Asia on a societal perspective is already quite dramatic, but it can still be considered in most of these countries, not the poorest countries, but the more richer countries, it's more like this convenience kind of demand. It's like the holidays. Indeed. I heard even that in some places you can no longer have weddings on the weekends or things like that, but you will always remember the day of your wedding, but it's not going to change your life. We have not yet seen that drastic demand destruction, COVID-style demand destruction. Yeah. And the problem is that, when you hear the rhetoric from Trump and things like that, it's just this, no, but don't worry, in 2 weeks' time, it's all over. And this was the case 2 weeks ago, and it's the case now, and it's going to be the case in 2 weeks. And the more we go into this, so the problem is that governments are sort of taking mini measures, and they're not taking drastic measures. But I would not exclude that possibility. China saying, okay, no more exports. And that has an impact on everyone else. Pakistan, Philippines, Vietnam, all of these countries are suffering because of that. But other countries are just doing whatever they can. But I don't think we've seen the end of this at all in terms of drastic measures. And in Europe, we're still comfortable. As I said, I think in one of my reports 3 weeks ago, that if gasoline prices are costing you 40 euros extra per month, okay, well, that's a coffee a day. It's still not the big issue. But when you don't have any gasoline left, probably diesel or jet, it's more relevant. Then it's a different story. But and then the governments will act and they will force bans on export. You will find situations where perhaps France and Germany will buy crude on a government basis, and some other countries, smaller countries, will have less crude to run because they couldn't have this political power to buy the crude. You're going to see things like that, I'm pretty sure. Not to sound dramatic, but it is a dramatic situation, and I don't think the general public is understanding how dramatic it is.
I think just to bear in mind then, when we're talking about demand destruction, and to go back to the numbers very quickly, 2020, peak global lockdowns, admittedly not for the whole year, right? It was spread out across the year. But 2020, demand was about 8 million barrels a day lower year on year. So that's what we saw from that global demand destruction event that we hadn't seen the likes of before. Massive lockdowns, 8 million barrels a day on a global basis. And that's not too far away from the numbers that we're talking about in terms of lost supply here. We're not talking about that lost supply being out the market for the whole year. It's all on a scale. But even if you have everybody working from home, everyone working from home, reducing all of these non-essentials that we had before, it's not as though you can just immediately take out 20 million barrels a day of demand, right? Even something like 5 million barrels a day on a global perspective is very painful to do for reduced demand.
I think that's the most important number we've given today. People need to understand that the peak of COVID was 8 million barrels a day. If that's the number, but yeah.
Individual months
that
will have been more, but
how to solve the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And on that lovely light note.
Yeah, this light note, I think it's a bit too early to start drinking, but I'm going to start thinking about it. It is not reassuring. Do you want to maybe end up with freight?
Yeah, I think the biggest story, at least in the Atlantic Basin, is that we expected the Gulf Coast to get tight, and it has gotten very tight. The supply lists are very short, but it's happened without exports having really ticked up a huge amount. Actually, last week, crude exports were more like 3.5 million barrels a day rather than the 5 million the week prior. So we're seeing some maybe logistical constraints, maybe just vessel availability constraints. TD25 and TC14 came off a little bit before Easter. I imagine they are going to pick up again quite strongly next week because, again, the ARBs remain wide open on both and on products. And then just to go back quickly, TC2, which has been slightly left behind so far, has been seeing a lot more love this week. It's been coming up. Vessel supply lists again for TC2 are coming off quite strongly. And we were talking about the TA ARB, the East-West. Also on naphtha, we've seen diesel ARBs open from Europe to the east. So TC2 is on the up as well. Probably also has only more room to the upside. So a good time to be a ship owner, I think.
Definitely. Well, that's a lighter note, or at least a happier note for some people. Guys, thank you so much for your time today. Let's keep monitoring the situation. Again, we might have additional emergency podcasts depending on the news. This week, it was more of the same in terms of the announcements, Trump, etc. But when you look at the jet and diesel market, I don't think anyone can say this is more of the same. So we'll keep monitoring and we'll keep you posted. And if you have any questions, guys, listeners, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help. We're here to provide this sort of external view, unbiased. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.